You're blocking the aisle. Other passengers need to get by. Move faster or step aside.
She said sharply, not even waiting for Amara to fully settle into her seat. Sometimes, the worst kind of cruelty doesn't announce itself with shouting or violence. Sometimes it's quiet, dismissive, a turned head, a rolled eye, a service call button, ignored. And on Flight 2847 from Newark to Chicago, that quiet cruelty was about to spark something no one on that plane could have predicted. Because the woman sitting in seat 14C, the one being ignored, overlooked, treated like she was invisible, wasn't who they thought she was. Not even close. This is the story of Amara Okafor, and what happened when one flight attendant made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating her. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where nothing feels particularly special. Just another flight. Just another crowd of tired passengers shuffling down the narrow aisle, shoving carry-ons into overhead bins, settling into cramped seats for a 2-hour journey. Amara Okafor was one of them. She moved slowly down the aisle, her gait uneven, her left leg dragging slightly with each step. In her right hand, she gripped a sleek black cane, lightweight but sturdy. The kind designed for someone who needed support but refused to let it define them. She was in her early 40s. Dark skin, warm brown eyes that held a quiet intelligence. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse. Professional. Composed. Unassuming. She didn't look like someone you'd notice in a crowd. And that was exactly the problem. Because from the moment she stepped onto that plane, she was treated like she didn't matter. Amara had booked her ticket weeks in advance. She'd specifically requested an aisle seat, 14C, because it gave her room to stretch her leg, to stand when the cramping got bad, to move without disturbing anyone. She'd also requested pre-boarding assistance. It was a small accommodation. Standard procedure for passengers with mobility challenges. The airline's own policy, printed right there on their website. But when Amara arrived at the gate, her request had been overlooked. No assistance. No early boarding. Just a gate agent who barely looked up from her screen and told her to wait with everyone else. So Amara did. She stood in line, waited her turn, leaned on her cane as other passengers pushed past her, dragging roller bags and oversized backpacks, some nearly knocking into her as they rushed to board. No one apologized. No one seemed to notice. And when she finally made it onto the plane, exhausted and aching, she found her row. 14C. Aisle seat. Finally, she eased herself down carefully, folding her cane and tucking it beside her seat. She exhaled, relieved, and closed her eyes for just a moment. That's when she heard the voice. Excuse me. Excuse me. Amara opened her eyes. Standing over her was a flight attendant. Her name tag read, Vivian Stroud. Mid-30s. Blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Lips pressed into a thin line. Arms crossed. And her expression? Irritation. Pure, undisguised irritation. You need to put that cane in the overhead bin, Vivian said flatly. It's a safety hazard. Amara blinked. I'm sorry. Your cane, Vivian repeated, her tone sharper now. It can't stay there. FAA regulations. Overhead bin or under the seat in front of you. Amara's voice was calm. Patient. I need it within reach. I have a mobility disability. If there's an emergency, I need to be able to. Then put it under the seat, Vivian interrupted. That's what everyone else does. Amara glanced down. The space under the seat in front of her was already occupied by her own small personal bag, the one that held her medication, her phone charger, her documents. There's no room, Amara said quietly. Could I keep it beside me? It's not blocking the aisle. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Ma'am, I don't have time to argue with you. Either put it in the bin, or I'll have to ask you to leave the flight. Let me say that again. She threatened to remove her from the flight for needing her mobility aid within reach. Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. Didn't argue. Didn't cause a scene. She just nodded. Understood, she said quietly. And she handed Vivian the cane. Vivian snatched it without a word, shoved it into the overhead bin 3 rows back, and walked away. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just gone. Amara sat there, staring at the seat in front of her. Around her, passengers whispered. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband. That was ridiculous, she murmured. She clearly needs that. An older man 2 rows up shook his head in disgust. But no one said anything. No one stood up. No one confronted Vivian. Because that's how it works, isn't it? We see something wrong. We feel uncomfortable. We whisper about it. But we don't act. And Vivian Stroud? She didn't care. She moved through the cabin with brisk efficiency, handing out blankets, taking drink orders, smiling at passengers in first class. But when she passed row 14, she didn't even glance at Amara. 20 minutes into the flight, Amara pressed her call button. The little light above her seat blinked on. She waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. Vivian walked past her. Twice. She saw the light. She had to have seen it. But she didn't stop. Amara pressed it again. Still nothing. A younger flight attendant, a man in his 20s with kind eyes and a nervous energy, finally noticed. His name tag read, Kyle. Hi. Can I help you with something? He asked, leaning down. Amara's voice was steady, but strained. Yes. I need my cane. I'm starting to cramp, and I need to stand and move a bit. Could you get it from the overhead bin? Kyle nodded immediately. Of course. Just give me 1 second. He turned toward the bin, and Vivian appeared. I've got this, Kyle, she said coldly. Kyle hesitated. She just needs her. I said I've got this. Kyle backed off. Vivian turned to Amara, her expression unreadable. Your cane is fine where it is, she said flatly. Amara stared at her. I needed to stand. My leg. You can wait until we land. That's over an hour from now. Then I suggest you get comfortable. The cabin went quiet. Passengers were watching now. Not subtly. They were staring. The woman across the aisle leaned forward. Excuse me. Why can't she just have her cane? Vivian's head snapped toward her. Ma'am, I need you to stay out of this. But she clearly needs. Stay out of this. The woman sat back, stunned. Another passenger, a man in a business suit, spoke up from 2 rows back. This is ridiculous. Just give her the cane. Vivian's face flushed red. If anyone else interrupts, I will have the captain notified, and we will land this plane early. Do you all understand? Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. And Amara? She just sat there. Calm. Composed. But her hands were trembling. Vivian walked away. And for the next 30 minutes, Amara sat in that seat, her leg throbbing, her body aching, her dignity stripped away in front of 100 strangers. But she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She just sat and watched and waited. Because Amara Okafor had learned a long time ago that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly, waits for the right moment, and then it moves. It was 43 minutes into the flight when it happened. The overhead speakers crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it. Something urgent. We've received a priority communication from air traffic control. We are going to need all passengers to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare for an unscheduled briefing. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Vivian's face went pale. Kyle looked confused. And Amara? She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound ID wallet. She didn't open it. Not yet. She just held it and waited. The plane's intercom clicked again. Vivian Stroud, please report to the cockpit immediately. Every head in the cabin turned. Vivian's face went from pale to gray. She walked stiffly toward the front of the plane, her hands trembling slightly as she knocked on the cockpit door. It opened. She stepped inside. And 30 seconds later, the door flew open. The captain emerged. A tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and a jaw set like stone. His eyes scanned the cabin. And then they landed on Amara. He walked straight toward her. The entire plane watched. He stopped at row 14, and in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, Ma'am, I need to apologize on behalf of this airline. We were not aware of who you are. Amara looked up at him, and for the first time since boarding, she smiled. You are now, she said quietly. The captain's expression was grim. Behind him, Vivian stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, her face drained of all color. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. Who is she? What's happening? What did she do? And Amara Okafor sat there, calm as ever, her ID wallet resting in her lap. Still closed. Still secret. But not for long. Because in just a few moments, everyone on that plane was about to learn exactly who they'd been ignoring. And once they did, nothing would ever be the same. What happened next didn't just change that flight. It changed an entire airline. And the woman they tried to silence? She was just getting started. The captain stood in the aisle, his hand extended toward Amara. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I truly apologize. If I had known." Amara raised her hand gently, stopping him. "Captain," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The captain's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right," he said. And then he did something no one expected. He turned to face the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice projecting through the aircraft. "My name is Captain Raymond Torres, and I need to inform you that this flight is now under federal observation protocol." Gasps rippled through the rows. "Federal?" someone whispered. "What does that mean?" Captain Torres continued. "The woman in seat 14C is Dr. Amara Okafor. She is the Deputy Director of the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection." Silence. Complete, total silence. And then, chaos. Passengers erupted into whispers, pulling out phones, leaning across seats to talk to strangers. Did he just say Department of Transportation? She works for the federal government? Oh my God, that flight attendant is done. In the cockpit doorway, Vivian Stroud's legs buckled slightly. She grabbed the frame to steady herself, her face a mask of pure horror. Kyle, the younger flight attendant, stood frozen near the galley, his mouth hanging open. And Amara? She finally opened her ID wallet. She held it up, just slightly, so the passengers nearest to her could see. The official seal. The federal badge. The credentials that proved exactly who she was. A woman whose entire job was to investigate airline violations, to protect passengers, to enforce the laws that people like Vivian Stroud had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. Captain Torres gestured to Vivian. "Ms. Stroud, I need you to remain on the flight deck. Do not interact with any passengers. Do you understand?" Vivian nodded mutely, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands shaking. She disappeared back into the cockpit. The captain turned back to Amara. "Dr. Okafor, is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable for the remainder of this flight?" Amara's voice was steady, professional. "My cane, please. And I'd like to file a formal in-flight incident report before we land." "Of course." Kyle practically sprinted to the overhead bin, retrieved Amara's cane, and handed it to her with both hands, as if it were made of glass. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I tried to." "I know," Amara said gently. "You did what you could. Thank you." Kyle's eyes welled up. He nodded and stepped back. Captain Torres crouched beside Amara's seat, his voice low. "Dr. Okafor, I want you to know that as soon as we land, this incident will be reported to our operations director, our legal team, and your office directly. We will cooperate fully with any investigation." Amara looked at him. "You will, because federal law requires it. But I appreciate you saying so." The captain stood, his expression grave. He knew what was coming. They all did. For the remaining hour of the flight, the cabin was eerily quiet. Passengers whispered among themselves, but no one spoke loudly. No one laughed. No one watched movies or listened to music. They just sat, processing, because they had witnessed something. Something they couldn't unsee. They had watched a disabled black woman be humiliated, dismissed, and threatened with removal from a flight. And they had done nothing. Oh, a few had spoken up. A few had murmured their disapproval. But not enough. Not loudly enough. Not strongly enough. And now, sitting in their seats with their complimentary pretzels and ginger ale, they were confronting an uncomfortable truth. Silence is a choice. And sometimes, that choice has consequences. When the plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare, no one moved. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but passengers stayed seated, watching, waiting. Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have federal personnel boarding the aircraft." 2 men in dark suits entered through the forward door. Federal aviation inspectors. They moved directly to the cockpit. Moments later, Vivian Stroud emerged, flanked by the 2 men. Her face was blotchy, her eyes downcast. She didn't look at anyone as she was escorted off the plane. The cabin was silent. And then, slowly, Amara stood. She gripped her cane, gathered her belongings, and walked down the aisle with the same quiet dignity she'd carried onto the plane. Passengers watched her pass. Some looked ashamed. Some looked angry. And one woman, the one who'd spoken up earlier, reached out as Amara passed. "Thank you," she whispered. Amara paused. She looked at the woman, and she nodded. "Thank you for speaking," Amara said softly. It mattered. And then she was gone. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just make headlines. It sparked a firestorm. Within 6 hours of landing, the incident report was filed. Within 12 hours, it was on the desk of the Secretary of Transportation. Within 24 hours, it was national news. DOT official discriminated against on commercial flight. Federal investigator denied mobility aid, threatened with removal. Airline under fire after treatment of disabled passenger. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about Amara. Because Dr. Amara Okafor wasn't just any federal investigator. She was one of the leading architects of the Air Carrier Access Act enforcement guidelines. She had spent the last 8 years investigating complaints of disability discrimination in aviation. She had testified before Congress. She had written policy. She had fought, tirelessly, for the rights of passengers like her. And now, she had become the story. The airline, we'll call them Skyward Airlines, released a statement within 48 hours. It was carefully worded. Corporate. Sterile. Skyward Airlines takes all allegations of discrimination seriously. We are conducting a thorough internal review and will take appropriate action. Appropriate action. The internet exploded. Hashtag Skyward Shame started trending. Hashtag Amara Okafor trended in 17 countries. Disability rights advocates flooded social media with their own stories. Stories of being ignored, dismissed, humiliated on flights. Stories that had been buried for years. And now, they were everywhere. A passenger from Flight 2847 posted a video she'd recorded on her phone. It showed Vivian Stroud standing over Amara, arms crossed, voice dripping with disdain. "Either put it in the bin, or I'll have to ask you to leave the flight." The video went viral in 3 hours. 10 million views. 20 million. 50 million. News outlets picked it up. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, BBC. This is what systemic ableism looks like. A federal official, treated like she didn't matter. If this can happen to her, what's happening to everyone else? 1 week after the flight, Skyward Airlines held a press conference. Their CEO, a man named Gregory Pemberton, stood behind a podium, flanked by lawyers. He read from a prepared statement. "We deeply regret the experience Dr. Okafor had on Flight 2847. Our actions fell far short of the standards we hold ourselves to. Effective immediately, Flight Attendant Vivian Stroud has been terminated. We are also implementing mandatory disability awareness training for all staff, and we are launching a comprehensive review of our accessibility policies." Questions erupted from the press. Is Ms. Stroud facing legal charges? Will Dr. Okafor be filing a lawsuit? What about the other passengers who witnessed this? Will they be interviewed? Pemberton deflected, deferred, promised transparency, but it wasn't enough. Because 3 days later, the Department of Transportation announced a formal investigation into Skyward Airlines. Not just for this incident, for a pattern of violations. Turns out, Dr. Okafor's case wasn't isolated. The DOT had received over 200 complaints against Skyward Airlines in the past 3 years alone. Complaints about wheelchair damage. Complaints about denied boarding for passengers with service animals. Complaints about inaccessible lavatories, untrained staff, ignored requests for assistance. 200 complaints. And the airline had done nothing. Within 2 weeks, congressional hearings were scheduled. The Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation announced they would be investigating enforcement of the Air Carrier Access Act. Dr. Amara Okafor was invited to testify. And testify she did. She sat before a panel of senators, her cane resting against the table, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't about one flight attendant," she said. "This isn't even about one airline. This is about a culture that treats disabled passengers as inconveniences, as problems to manage, as people who should be grateful just to be allowed on a plane." She paused, letting her words settle. "I am a federal investigator. I have resources. I have knowledge. I have power. And I was still treated with contempt. So I want you to imagine, for just a moment, what happens to passengers who don't have what I have, who don't know their rights, who are too afraid to speak up. What happens to them?" The hearing room was silent. One senator leaned forward. "Dr. Okafor, what do you believe needs to change?" Amara didn't hesitate. "Accountability. Real consequences for airlines that violate the law. Mandatory training that isn't just a PowerPoint presentation. Federal monitors on flights. Transparent reporting of complaints. And most importantly, a shift in culture. Disabled passengers are not burdens. We are human beings, and we deserve to be treated that way. 6 months later, the changes began. The DOT levied a $4.2 million fine against Skyward Airlines, the largest disability discrimination penalty in aviation history. The airline was placed under a consent decree requiring federal oversight of their accessibility policies for the next 5 years. They were required to hire a chief accessibility officer. They were required to implement quarterly audits. They were required to establish a passenger advisory board made up of disabled travelers. And Vivian Stroud? She didn't just lose her job. She was placed on the federal Do Not Hire list for airline personnel. She would never work in aviation again. But here's what's important. This wasn't about revenge. Amara made that clear in every interview she gave. I don't want Vivian Stroud's life destroyed, she said in one interview. I want her to understand the harm she caused. I want her to learn, to grow, to never treat another person the way she treated me. But more than that, Amara continued, I want systems that don't allow people like her to thrive unchecked. I want airlines where discrimination isn't just against policy. It's impossible. 3 months after the hearings, Amara received a letter. It was handwritten, 3 pages long. It was from a woman named Judith Chun. Judith was a wheelchair user. She had been flying for a business trip 2 years earlier when her wheelchair was destroyed by an airline. She had filed a complaint. It went nowhere. She gave up. But after seeing Amara's story, she refiled. This time, the airline responded. This time, they compensated her. This time, they apologized. You gave me my voice back, Judith wrote. Thank you. Amara kept that letter on her desk. Because that's what this was really about. Not one flight. Not one flight attendant. But thousands of people who had been silenced, ignored, and dismissed. People who now had hope. The story of Flight 2847 became more than a viral moment. It became a case study. It was taught in airline training programs. It was cited in federal policy recommendations. It was referenced in disability rights advocacy. And Amara? She kept doing what she'd always done. Investigating. Advocating. Fighting. Because she knew the work wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. But something had shifted. People were paying attention. Passengers were speaking up. Airlines were being held accountable. And slowly, painfully slowly, change was happening. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Amara Okafor didn't need a badge to deserve respect. She didn't need a title to deserve dignity. She didn't need power to deserve basic human decency. None of us do. But the reason her story mattered, the reason it sparked a movement, is because she refused to be silent. She documented everything. She knew her rights. She used her voice. And when the system tried to ignore her, she made them listen. But here's the thing. Amara couldn't have done it alone. The passengers who spoke up, however quietly, mattered. The flight attendant who tried to help, mattered. The journalists who covered the story, mattered. The advocates who amplified it, mattered. Justice isn't a solo act. It's a chorus. And every voice, no matter how small, adds to the song. So the next time you see someone being mistreated, the next time you witness injustice, on a plane, in a store, on the street, don't just whisper. Don't just shake your head. Speak up. Record it. Report it. Because you never know who's watching. You never know whose life you might change. You never know when your voice might be the one that tips the scales. Amara Okafor sat in seat 14C and was treated like she was invisible. But she wasn't invisible. She was powerful. She was prepared. And she was done being silent. The question is, are you? This is the story of how one flight attendant's cruelty became a catalyst for change. How one woman's dignity became a movement. And how a quiet moment of injustice became impossible to ignore. Don't let them make you invisible. Speak. Stand. And never, ever stop fighting for what's right.